breaking through.
Cannabis has been used by humans for more than 6,000 years. The plant was legal for the majority of history, including in the United States, where its cultivation was encouraged by the government in the 17th century. In 1619, Virginian farmers were even required by law to grow hemp. Later, in 1937, a decades-long propaganda campaign culminated in the federal criminalization of cannabis. Harry J. Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, almost single-handedly convinced Congress to pass the Marijuana Tax Act, primarily by inciting fear of Mexicans and African Americans associated with the drug. For example, at a 1937 congressional hearing on the proposed act, Anslinger presented a letter from the editor of the Alamosa Daily Courier in Colorado pleading, "I wish I could show you what a small marijuana cigarette can do to one of our degenerate Spanish-speaking residents. That's why our problem is so great. The greatest percentage of our population is composed of Spanish-speaking persons, most of who are low mentally because of social and racial conditions." In a letter to Congress in support of the act, Mrs. Hamilton Wright, a special representative of Anslinger's Bureau of Narcotics, wrote, "We know it as the ordinary hempweed, which can be grown in any backyard, in any state in the Union. Its use as a stimulant or narcotic is, however, of recent date. It was introduced about 10 years ago by Mexican peddlers in the form of cigarettes. Its use has spread like wildfire and is associated with crime in its most vicious aspects." About 77 years later, and reefer madness-style fear-based propaganda is still having an effect.
I've seen too many felonies, and I don't mean pot sales or growing pot like this guy up in Connecticut. I mean people on pot that shoot each other, that stab each other, strangle each other, drive under the influence, kill families, wipe out a whole family. The first time I ever came in the first case, it was a plea, and there was this gorgeous lady standing in the middle of the courtroom crying, and I didn't understand. I said, well, what is this case? Somebody else was taking a plea, and they said she's a stockbroker, she got addicted to pot, she ended up losing her job, wrecked her car, couldn't make the house payments on her house, so her husband got custody of the children, so now she has no car, no house, no family, nothing.
How's it going in Colorado with pot being legal?
We've had reports from our law enforcement officials. Recently, the Denver police chief commented that the rollout has gone smoothly. As of a couple days ago, they hadn't attributed any acts of violence or increased crimes to the fact that we have these shops on our street corners. I think it's a matter of time, though. I think it's simply a matter of time before we start seeing some problems.
Going down the path to legalization in this country is reckless and irresponsible. The department has set up factors, sir, and I get that. I'm talking about the long-term impact of legalization in the United States. It scares us. The treatment people are afraid. The education people are afraid. Law enforcement is worried what is going to happen. In every part of the world where this experiment has been tried, it has failed time and time again. And here we are. The voters have decided to do this. It's going to impact the state, the surrounding states, and California's done, ma'am, you know that. California's turned around and done a lot of great things, what they're doing, what they're seeing, and I wish some people would take example of what's happening. There are more dispensaries in Denver than there are Starbucks.
I think you're telling me that federal law ought to be enforced.
Potheads, no, I'm going to be paying for their food, housing, now for their health care, apparently, because they can't perform any useful jobs. Can you imagine if,
the vast majority of people that take marijuana on a recreational basis are not, by your definition, potheads.
The point is,
in the same way that most people who drink alcohol are not alcoholics or heavy drinkers with a problem.
Once the cat is out of the bag, you can't put it back in. That was the problem.
Yeah, but the issue is not that.
Again, to pick up where I was in the middle of my sentence, but during Prohibition...
the issue is not that, is it?
The issue is, why do we treat every alcohol-related disease, cirrhosis of the liver, accidents as a result of alcohol, went down precipitously. It will go up. We will have this is how many potheads we have when it's illegal.
Nobody has
I think that's just about enough.
Let me answer you. Nobody has ever overdosed on cannabis. Did you know that?
So what? They can't perform daily functions. They're going to be on my tax bill.
But you accept that people die of smoking. You accept that people can overdose on too much alcohol.
Well, everybody dies eventually.
That's your answer.
Since Colorado and Washington states legalized recreational cannabis, prohibitionists have amplified their shameful rhetoric in U.S. media, showcasing desperation as pot prohibition crumbles. While dropping the blatant racism of their 20th century predecessors, claims of the drug's ability to cause violence are still made, despite evidence to the contrary. In reality, any violence associated with cannabis is a result of its illegality. For example, in the past decade, 60 to 100,000 Mexicans have been killed as cartels vie for their share of the black market drug trade. More than 60% of cartel profits come from cannabis sales, according to the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy.
It should not be a criminal issue.
So we have a point of consensus on that.
Absolutely, I agree with him.
Hundreds of thousands of Americans.
Right.
Or even giving them a arrest record or taking away their jobs.
There should not be an arrest record for marijuana. But you don't legalize it and mass produce it. Just like the alcohol industry and the tobacco
By that criteria, would you
well.
then outlaw alcohol and tobacco? And if not, why
Too
not?
late.
Too late?
Too late, okay? Why would I add a third industry that is a dangerous industry that gets your children and my children even more
Howard,
exposure
you're not adding a third
to
industry.
marijuana?
You're not adding a third
Oh,
industry.
we are.
You're transforming it from an illegal industry
Alcohol,
to a legal industry.
Tobacco,
You're
marijuana is a disaster
Howard, you're
for us.
transforming it from an illegal industry where conflicts are resolved with violence, where you empower organized criminals, where you arrest huge numbers of people. Wait a second. Into a legal industry. The idea is this will now be legal. Colorado will get substantial tax revenues. The money in Colorado is going for school construction. The money will go for drug treatment. So let's be realistic.
As we sit here right now, there are millions of dollars being raised to create acres and acres of marijuana to be mass produced.
Howard, do you want to know?
Anti-cannabis advocates love to discuss the negative effects cannabis legalization could have on children. What these modern prohibitionists don't seem to understand is cannabis already exists. The cannabis market already exists. The plant is easily attainable and distributed globally on massive scales. Legalization does not create a new industry, but rather brings an existing industry into the free market where taxes are paid, cannabis users, farmers, and dealers are safe and happy, children are denied the drug at checkouts, and nobody dies unnecessarily. Another argument often made by prohibitionists is how stupid and lazy cannabis makes its users. Unlike the commenters making these claims, I actually use cannabis. In fact, I'm high right now. Further, I was high on cannabis when I completed both college and university, with honors. But to prove their point, prohibitionists frequently cite a 2012 study that showed cannabis permanently lowers the IQ of adolescent users.
You know, pot makes you stupid, and he knows that, and we don't need more stupidity.
What they do not mention is the more recent study suggesting economic class and home life likely lowered the young user's IQ points, not cannabis. While some studies claim cannabis use is harmful for developing brains, other studies conclude cannabis has the ability to help many illnesses and even promote brain cell growth. Regardless, adults should be given the respect to make the decision for themselves. As they have for decades, prohibitionists also argue that cannabis is a gateway drug. Again, the black market creates this effect, if one exists, as many dealers sell drugs other than cannabis.
Recognize that marijuana is what's known as a gateway drug. It tends to be a starter drug for people who move on to heavier duty drugs, sometimes legal, sometimes illegal. And I don't think this is something that we really want for our society. You know, we're gradually just removing all the barriers to heathenistic activity. And, you know, it's just, we're changing so rapidly to a different type of society, and nobody is getting a chance to discuss it because, you know, it's taboo. It's politically incorrect. You're not supposed to talk about these things.
How do you balance it, though? Let me say, how do you balance it? I mean, some people would say, you know, it's freedom of choice. You know, it's like, you know, it's a government saying you can't have marijuana, you know, versus, I mean, I understand the hedonist aspect and maybe even the blunted motivation if you're getting high all the time. But, I mean, what about the whole issue of your rights?
Well, do those same people argue for freedom of choice when someone says, I want to buy a gun, I want to buy an Uzi, I want to buy, let's be consistent with this thing. But, more importantly, we should sit down and talk about ramifications. There are studies that show that, marijuana is a gateway drug. We need to talk about how do we use it in such a way that it doesn't result in addiction of many, many people in our society. Why can't we talk about these things? That's what I want to know.
People talk about this as a gateway drug. Do you buy that at all?
We have to understand what gateway means. So if people are saying that the majority of people who use cocaine and use heroin have used marijuana, that's right. That's absolutely right. But the vast majority of the people who use marijuana don't go on to those other drugs.
So you're saying that it's not that the pot necessarily leads to these things, it's just that's what they were first able to get their hands on. And
if you want to know about a gateway drug, it's tobacco and alcohol. Those are our gateway drugs. I am really disturbed by the whole idea that whether or not something is addictive is a criteria for it being illegal. That whole logic is very flawed to me. If that's the case, for sure alcohol's got to be illegal, tobacco's got to be illegal, but pills got to be illegal, your beloved Ambien, Anderson's got to be illegal.
My beloved Ambien. But it's very easy to demonize marijuana. It has been for so long. I mean, and I think these studies are changing because more people have done it and started to see what it's like in their own life.
It's a moralizing attitude that people have about the human relationship with
substances. So when people ask you, is it addictive, do you believe it's addictive?
I don't believe or not believe. I've been struggling with it for my patients with it for 25 years. I've treated 10,000 addicts in my career, and probably 5 to 10% of them had marijuana addiction. And for some, that's not a big number, and it's not, as you say, it's very uncommon. They said 1 out of 11. It's nowhere near that. I'd
Dr.
say.
Do you believe it's addictive?
That's about 9%. It's absolutely addictive, but that's not saying much. Alcohol is addictive. Tobacco is addictive. All of these things are potentially addictive. The most important thing here is that the vast majority of people who smoke marijuana, 90% do not get addicted. Yeah. The vast majority of people who even use heroin don't get addicted.
And you said the statistic that the person interviewed quoted about the high THC levels, you said that's factually incorrect.
That's factually incorrect. He said that the average THC concentration in cigarettes is 30%. The average is about 5 to 6%. So that's just hyperbole. And that's what we get in this discussion oftentimes is hyperbole.
At the end of January 2014, Fox News pundits talked frequently about a study saying cannabis addiction may be hereditary, which is ironic considering they typically ignore science altogether. Of course, Fox News failed to mention other studies showing that addiction in general may be hereditary. In fact, according to a study by the University of Washington, tobacco is the worst culprit of hereditary addiction.
If it's legalized, we know rates of use will increase, availability will increase, and accessibility. And as you know, Chris, if you have a predisposition to addiction, this is going to be a gateway. And frankly, Chris, it's a harmful drug in and of itself. Like I was lucky, Chris, I got in and crashed early because I used harder drugs. Marijuana is insidious. You could be using it for most of your life and not wake up to the fact that you're on a slow train to nowhere. And that's the damaging part about marijuana for our country.
According to recent polls, about 56% of Americans are in favor of legal cannabis, and about 70% of Canadians want the drug legalized or decriminalized. This means prohibitionists are the minority. So why do mainstream media outlets allow people with such little knowledge of the topic to argue their flimsy opinions? The more cannabis legalization appears inevitable, the more prohibitionists seem to regress to reefer madness-style propaganda.
The judge allows in evidence that Trayvon Martin did have marijuana in his system at the time he died. What difference, if any, does that make? Because I've seen too many felonies, and I don't mean pot sales or growing pot like this guy up in Connecticut. To me, it means that he is less likely to pick a fight with someone. I mean, people on pot shoot each other. Isn't it true that when you smoke pot, you just want to lay on the sofa and eat? People on pot kill families, wipe out a whole family. The common connotation pot goes with lethargy, with the munchies, with wanting to eat, with being laid back, not with chasing somebody down, jumping out from behind bushes, beating them in the head till they're pulpy, and basically starting mortal combat.
That's not what you typically equate with smoking a doobie.
I've got to be drinking booze, or I've got to be smoking, or I've got to be high on pot.
Breaking through, breaking through.